My name is David Krugler, and I'm a professor of history at the University of Wisconsin Platteville, where I've taught since 1997. I completed my PhD in American history at the University of Illinois at Urbana-Champaign in 1997, and also did my master's there. I am a historian of the 20th century United States, and much of my early work focused on the Cold War. But recently, I've turned my attention to the World War I era, specifically the spike in white mob violence that occurred during and after the war, and more importantly, Black resistance to it, the Black response to it. That led to the book that you're reading, 1919, The Year of Racial Violence, How African Americans Fought Back. Like a lot of authors will tell you, I didn't set out to write that particular book. I initially envisioned a narrative history of 1919 because there's so much going on. You have the flu epidemic, which of course is of renewed interest to us these days. You also have labor strikes, the Red Scare, so much going on. But while I was in the preliminary stages, a fine writer by the name of Anne Hagedorn, who wrote for the Wall Street Journal and then took a leave of absence to do a work of history, she published a book, Savage Peace, Hope and Fear in America, 1919. So for me, that, ended my plan to do the same. And though I was initially disappointed, it turned out to be a blessing in disguise because it prodded me to ask, well, what's most interesting about 1919 to me? And I found myself coming back more and more to the racial violence and Black resistance to it. There's also been a lot written on the racial violence of 1919, but not a focus on African American agency. So that's what I wanted to do in the book. And through my research, I developed this thesis of a three-front war. There's armed self-defense, often led by veterans. We especially see that in Chicago in the summer of 1919. But also a sustained struggle to get the truth out because there's so much malicious and fallacious and inaccurate reporting on the violence that African Americans understand we have to set the record straight. Otherwise, it will be worse than just being victims of white mob violence. We'll be, blamed for causing it. We'll be presented as the perpetrators when we are not. And then both of those aspects of resistance feed into the court battles. If you don't set the record straight, then the court system and jurors especially are going to make judgments based upon inaccurate and misleading information. Setting the record straight helps set up some court victories.
Yeah, and it's an incredible book in many ways because you go into such detail of the different incidents of racial terror. But I guess if you could speak a little bit more about the returning veterans and this idea of the new Negro that came out of the press, I guess, mainly from the Black press, correct?
Absolutely. So even before the United States enters World War I or World War I begins, lots and lots of African Americans are calling for sustained efforts to win constitutional rights that have been stripped away, to win fair economic opportunity in industrializing America, and most of all, to stand up against white supremacy, stand up against Jim Crow, and the racial violence used to uphold both. This new Negro identity is in many ways a forceful rejection of the Booker T. Washington approach of racial uplift will bring its own rewards, will bring gradual acceptance. So a lot of the acolytes of the new Negro movement are harsh critics of Booker T. Washington and of his so-called Tuskegee machine. This then blends with the rhetoric that President Wilson uses to justify a belated American entry into the war. The world must be made safe for democracy, Wilson famously proclaimed in asking Congress for that declaration of war in April of 1917. Let's imagine how that sounds to 10 million or so African Americans who are living in a nation dedicated to representative government, built upon a constitution that is supposed to provide equality of rights. But in practice, that's not happening. The 15th Amendment is flagrantly violated across the US. Most Black men can't vote. The women's suffrage movement is even hostile toward Black women's participation in many ways. So, women's suffrage is starting to show itself as a part of white supremacy. That's really troubling too, because that's supposed to be a progressive reform. So many African Americans find themselves in a virtual enslavement, in what's known as debt peonage. This is especially true in Phillips County, where tenant farmers are working really hard and generating a lot of wealth for their white landlords, and they're being systematically and flagrantly cheated out of it. Is that a democracy? When they hear Wilson say, the world must be made safe for democracy, do your part, they have to make a choice. Do they say, yes, we'll be a part of a system that doesn't provide us with the fundamental rights of democracy? Do we walk away from it? Or do we say, okay, yes, we'll do our part, but then democracy needs to be fulfilled at home. We want democracy here. America must be made safe for democracy. When you look at the Black press in 1917, and even before that, like the Chicago Defender or the Pittsburgh Courier, we see this messaging like, all right, if we're going to be a part of this, we need to fulfill democracy at home, and we're going to fight for it. I mean, there's this understanding that it's not just going to be granted on the basis of military participation. One figure who struggles with this choice is W.E.B. Du Bois, and he comes down on the side of let's close ranks, let's join in this war effort. And then he has this wonderful editorial in May of 1919, in which he declares that Black veterans return from fighting, return fighting. They've saved democracy in France, and by the great Jehovah, they will save it in the United States of America, or know the reason why. These are the stirring, memorable words that close out the editorial. If you look at the first part, it's a very brief piece. In the first part, he lists all of the injustices and indignities African Americans suffer, and says, but we will be cursed by our descendants if we don't stand up and do something about it. I mean, yes, these forces are against us, but now is the moment to fight back.
Yeah, and then when these guys come back and they're reading things like this, and they're, I guess they were allowed to come back with and keep their weapons in some cases.
That's an interesting observation. There was a great fear that African American enlisted men were returning with weapons. We should keep in mind that the majority of Black enlisted men did not train with weapons. And this was a deliberate decision by the US Army to put them in so-called service of supply units, where they built roads or dug ditches and unloaded ships. So it's sort of a carryover of the menial labor to which so many Black men were relegated back home in the United States. Now, there were combat units, and the 8th Illinois Guard unit, which is federalized and put into combat with Black officers. They have weapons. But so great is the fear on the part of the War Department that Black men are returning with weapons that searches are carried out aboard troop transports. And no less a figure than Secretary of War Newton Baker, who in many ways is attentive to the participation of African Americans in the military and wants it to be a constructive experience, doesn't want there to be racial tension. But Baker himself says, we've got to do these searches, but search white men too. I don't want Black men to be singled out. And in the evidence I looked at, very few weapons were found. So there's this paranoia that Black veterans are coming back with weapons and that they're going to carry out a revolution. They're going to try to overthrow the US government. They have no intention to do so. They want the US government to fulfill its constitutional obligations.
Well, that I think will lead us to a discussion of what happened in Chicago in March of 1918 and kind of ended in July of 1919. So maybe if you could briefly talk about the race riot that sustained race riot.
Sure. Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned those dates, because we really need to begin Chicago's story in 1918, when African Americans begin to move out or try to move out of the so-called Black Belt, which was a compressed area on the South Side, in which African Americans in most instances were expected and forced to live. Due to the Great Migration, which was bringing tens of thousands of Black Southerners to Chicago to work in its packing houses, work in its railroads, work in its factories, housing is at a premium, the housing stock is low. So Black families with the means to do so begin to move into all white neighborhoods. And this often means they're moving into heavily Irish neighborhoods like Bridgeport and Canaryville. There is a sustained and organized effort to prevent that from happening. So we have a wave of terrorist bombings in Chicago in which newly occupied homes by African Americans are bombed or the target of arson. So too the offices of realtors who broker the deals. So with the war's end, a lot of residents in the neighborhoods adjoining the Black Belt, not just Bridgeport and Canaryville, but to the south, Kenwood, Hyde Park, they're determined to maintain the color line and to continue to use violence to do so. The color line then extends to the lakeshore itself. And on the south side of Chicago, there was not the wonderful beachfront and bike trail there is today. There were a lot of factories, a lot of industrial sites. And several Black teenagers built a raft and they floated it from their hiding spot into the lake. And it drifted to an area of the lake a few blocks south that was considered white only. And a young white man came out to a pier, to a breakwater, and started throwing rocks. And one of the Black teenagers aboard that raft later told historian William Tuttle, at first it was kind of a game because, he's throwing the rocks at us, but we can see them coming, right? We can dodge them. But one of the rocks hit a young man named Eugene Williams, who wasn't a strong swimmer, and he drowned. When his friends came back and they pointed out who had been throwing the rocks, a white police officer refused to arrest the rock thrower and prevented a Black officer from doing this. So this creates an altercation on the beach. As you might imagine, Black beachgoers are really angry and upset. I mean, a boy has been killed and the police are doing nothing about it. In fact, they're obstructing the arrest of the individual. This spills over into the city, and this became an opportunity for organized white gangs in Bridgeport to undertake the greatest effort so far to use violence to drive Blacks out of the neighborhood. So really what we see is ethnic cleansing after the incident on the beach, with white gangs going down the streets. And they're very methodical. I mean, we have the photographic evidence to show this. They know which homes are occupied by Black families, and they loot them mercilessly. They drive the occupants out and steal everything of value. We have photographs from this moment in Chicago's history where white children, some that seem to be barely old enough to go to school, are lined up in the broken windows of these homes, cheering as a photographer takes their picture. The homes next door are untouched. So this is often called a riot, but it's such a misleading word because this is not a riot. There's very methodical, premeditated violence going on. And then it extends from housing to employment, and Black packing house workers who have to cross these white neighborhoods are pulled off streetcars. They're chased down and they're brutally murdered. And again, we have photographic evidence of this. There was a photographer who was an immigrant from Japan, Jun Fujita, who took some really, still to this day, shocking photos of the violence. But I wouldn't want to end the story there. What's really important to know as well is that when the police fail to provide protection, veterans, Black veterans of the war, put on their uniforms, arm themselves, and they do this job. The newspapers report that they're out there indiscriminately shooting at whites. The police have to go after them. This is false. They're out there doing the job the police wouldn't do. And some of them got arrested when they were fighting back after they were attacked. So getting the truth out of what had happened becomes important then to defending these self-defenders who are protecting their community when they go into appear before judges and juries. The coroner's jury in Cook County, which did an investigation of Chicago's violence, praised Black veterans for helping keep calm. I mean, so the after report itself puts the lie to what the papers were saying at the time.
And there was, as you say, there was considerable Black press coverage of it. That's correct?
Yes, yes. So Chicago was the home of the Chicago Defender, published by Robert Abbott. Abbott was actually unable to put out an edition during Chicago's week-long violence because he was not allowed to use the press. The press he used wouldn't print the paper. And so it was a weekly already. So the Defender was late to get out reporting to correct what was going on. You know, the Chicago Daily News, the Chicago Tribune, other papers were sort of establishing a narrative of uncontrolled Black violence directed at whites. And that just wasn't the story. You know, that's not what was happening.
Well, and shifting gears a little bit, I'd love to talk about the Knoxville.
Okay, sure.
Because I found it incredible to read about, and I didn't know it, and it was it's quite a story.
Yeah, it really is. I mean, it has such a tragic ending. It's practically ready for a dramatic film treatment. So Knoxville, to set the stage, had a serial rapist on the loose in the late summer of 1919. And he had not been caught by Labor Day weekend. One of the assaults led to the shooting death of a woman present in the room where the assault took place. Investigating police, one officer in particular, came up with a suspect right away, before he even examined the scene, before evidence was collected. He had a grudge against a young Black man named Maurice Mays, who was widely rumored to be, and almost certainly was, the illegitimate son of Knoxville's white mayor. Maurice Mays was well known around town. He was a sharp dresser. He was close to the parents who raised him, a Black couple. He considered them his parents. Obviously, they were. They had adopted him when he was a baby and raised him. This police officer, he had a grudge against Mays, and he said, "I bet he did it." And so Mays was framed. There was no evidence linking him to the crime. Indeed, the evidence collected in his room strongly suggested that he couldn't have done it. His parents hired, the best attorney they could, a white attorney, to defend him. But he was going into a courtroom in which the prosecutor trafficked in crude, racist stereotypes, asked questions like, how, isn't it true you had postcards of white women in that room, your rented room? Guiding the all-white male jury to assure conviction. But this came after Mays was arrested and after a mob attempted to lynch him. In this case, when the mob descended on the courthouse in Knoxville, the sheriff took measures to protect his prisoner, and Mays was saved from the mob. This didn't happen in Omaha, for example, where there was a similar courthouse riot and a falsely accused Black man was brutally murdered by that mob. In this case, Mays was saved from the mob, but not from a rigged judicial system. The mob then turned its fury on Knoxville's Black community, which then defended itself. Unable to seize Mays and lynch him, they gut the courthouse, and then they turn onto the Black community, which arms itself and defends itself. So in Knoxville, we have another example of armed self-defense. After Mays is convicted and sentenced to death, his parents spend all of their savings filing appeals, and they ask for the help of the NAACP, which is reluctant to get involved because at this point the NAACP is really wary of touching cases in which a Black man has been accused of sexually assaulting a white woman, even if the evidence isn't there. The NAACP is also strapped for resources. And when you look at the correspondence, they're like, this is, just a case we can't afford to get involved in. But local branches raise money, but the appeals fail. And Maurice Mays was put to death. A capital sentence was carried out. He was innocent of the crime. The sexual assaults continued in Knoxville, even after he was arrested and before he was put to death. And it's such a tragic outcome. But although his life was not saved, when you look at the efforts to save him, they're really remarkable. And we do see a successful effort to save the lives of wrongly accused Black men in Arkansas, where 12 men are sentenced to death and their lives are saved.
Well, and I would like to kind of wrap up with this. You have a chapter on how state and federal efforts were then used after some of this to disarm. The lessons learned were, well, Black people seem to have guns, and we have to keep them from having those.
Yes. I mean, this was one of the most striking things I discovered in my research, was this systematic effort to disarm African Americans and to obstruct their access to legal firearms. This was carried out by the federal government through the Military Intelligence Division and the Bureau of Investigation, which was the forerunner of the FBI. And the man who would lead the FBI for the first 48 years of its existence, J. Edgar Hoover, was a prominent official in the B of I, the Bureau of Investigation at the time, and overseeing these efforts. The Hoover and the Bureau of Investigation and many, many federal officials believed Black armed self-defense was actually evidence of a premeditated insurrection, a conspiracy to kill white people. And therefore, access to firearms had to be stripped away. The Second Amendment we have today is not the Second Amendment Americans had at this time. The court had not yet ruled, the Supreme Court had not yet ruled that the Second Amendment applied to cities and localities. So a lot of these localities passed racially restrictive laws, banning Black people from buying weapons. In other instances, federal officials visited stores, especially hardware stores in the South, which were a common place selling firearms at the time, to ask if African Americans had come in to buy weapons. And the gun dealers themselves are saying, yeah, they do, but we don't sell to them. They have to have a note from a white man, that would say, this is necessary for hunting or something like that. It's happening in the South. There's concerns that firearms are being sold in Detroit to African Americans. So this systemic effort led by the national government, working with states, localities, and even private businesses to prevent access to those weapons. There was even a fear that railroad porters who were Black men at this time, that they were using their job to smuggle weapons across the country. These reports filtered up into the Army and to the top of the Justice Department.
Well, one of the things that we've learned in our group is that, there's always been a very strong fear in the South of Black uprising. And it was interesting to find out about, I'm not going to say it correct, but these bully groups that.
Cool. Yeah.
Yeah. So what were they, and how did they fit in?
Well, it's interesting. So, there were some Black organizations that were rather secretive at the time, like the African Blood Brotherhood, founded by Cyril Briggs in New York. But in the fears of white government officials, these were organizations that were far bigger than they actually were. In this fevered imagination, they had a national reach and intent that they did not. And so, if you think about, well, they're fixating on this one particular group they've heard rumors about, but the origins of this fear go way back. Fears of slave insurrections and uprisings, and notable instances of armed resistance to slavery, such as Nat Turner's rebellion in 1831. These are latter day versions of that. In 1919, we have federal government officials who are fearing a neo-slavery uprising. What happens in Phillips County, for example, I mean, there you have individuals, these tenant farmers are in a form of slavery. They're being cheated, and if they try to leave, they're forced back onto the land. I mean, they're cheated year after year to tie them to the land. They're peons. It's debt peonage. When they get a lawyer, when they hire a lawyer to get a fair accounting, they're attacked. And when they fight back, then they're blamed. It said they were carrying out an insurrection to kill all white people in Phillips County, Arkansas, which was majority Black at the time. So for whites in a majority Black county, to say there was this uprising, they were going to come kill us, that, spreads the fear. And then that's fed by government reports and press reporting as well.
Well, yeah, and it's so interesting too how the Red Scare leads into some of this, and then even like today we hear Black Lives Matter is somehow fueled by cultural Marxists and things like this. So some of these narratives are still with us.
That's a great connection. Yeah, a lot of these narratives are still with us. We haven't left them behind. And in 1919, federal officials were providing leading press outlets, such as the New York Times, with reports on subversion within. And when you look at how the New York Times presented it, they take at face value and report as fact what the report says. So for readers of that story, and it's not just the New York Times, it's other major papers as well. For readers, what their takeaway is, for white readers, wow, our federal government has uncovered this conspiracy, and it's driven by radicals, by communists who have willing Black participants or are tricking Blacks, to be a part of this. They were called dupes. And this, was believable to a lot of right readers because they accepted white supremacy. They believed people of African descent were already inferior intellectually to them and could be easily tricked by conniving communists.
Well, I think we could probably go on all afternoon, but you have things to do. And I would thank you very much for this discussion. And it's really important because I think one of the things we don't hear much about anymore or ever are Black resistance to kind of the White Terror. We don't hear about the White Terror, but then we also don't hear about the kind of the fight back.
Right. Yeah. I'm so glad that you and your group have taken interest in this subject and found my work.
Yeah, so thank you for it, and yeah, thank you for your time.